Now that I've asked everyone to please find a seat, I'll ask you to rise and we'll say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And on behalf of the Pennsylvania State Grange, I would like to welcome each and every one of you here today to our second broadband meeting here at the Farm Show. We had one last year, and when Vince and I talked this year as to what we would like to do, we decided we'd like to continue on with that theme since, as we all know, this is a project that's not going to get completed in 1 year, 2 years, maybe even 3 or 4 years. But it is a very important issue, not only here in Pennsylvania, but nationwide. I talk all the time as I travel throughout the state about people that have to take their children to school early or pick them up late so that they can complete their homework because they don't have adequate internet service at home. And that's definitely not right, not in America in 2018. We have seniors. I used to work for Perry County Transportation. I had one gentleman that lived in the western end of this county that if I would pick him up at 6 o'clock in the morning, it might be 8:30 until I dropped him off at the doctor's office in Camp Hill for a 15-minute appointment. Then he'd have to sit in the waiting room for a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe even an hour, till another bus would come back to pick him up for another 2.5 hour run back up to Perry County. In other words, he would spend 6 to 8 hours to see a doctor that the visit might last 10 to 15 minutes. He had had a very major stroke, and needless to say, till I got him home, he was totally wore out. If he would have had internet service, he could utilize telemedicine, and a lot of those appointments could have been done over the computer with the help of a webcam, and that 10 minutes would have been 10 minutes, not 6 hours. So these are the kinds of challenges that we face every day. You know, our agricultural community is buying farm equipment that's $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 with GPS units on it that can help. We talk about the Chesapeake Bay, and these GPS units help them utilize herbicides and fertilizers to the ultimate. But if you don't have internet, you're driving a fancy piece of equipment that is really only worth half what you paid for it, because you can't utilize that technology. So again, I won't take up a lot of time. Vince, I'll let him introduce the panel here. I will say we did get a very exciting piece of information at the Pennsylvania State Grange office last week. There is a company up in Potter County that just got a grant that is going to be putting down, and don't quote me on this, I believe if I remember right, it was like 500 miles of fiber optic cable in Potter County. That's huge. That area is very, very minimal on broadband and internet access. And with the use of fiber optic cable, they're going to be able to put up some mini cell towers here and there that they'll be able to get Wi-Fi and get it out into the communities in different areas up there. That will be a real plus. So we are gaining. We've got a long way to go, but we're gaining. So without any further ado, Vince,
Thank you, Wayne. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. How are you? We're here. Yeah. Considering the alternative, I'm glad you're here. First of all, once again, it's an honor to be with you. Last year's program on the broadband really kind of set the stage for the continued involvement of the Pennsylvania State Grange in our #1 issue. And one of my favorite phrases, so please tell me if you've heard this one before, because I think all of you have, is that broadband, universal broadband access, is to this century what rural electrification was to the last century. And that is, you need to make sure that rural America is not left behind. You need to make sure that economically, that rural America has the same economic technology tools And as Wayne mentioned, in terms of education, in terms of farming, etc., the rural areas should not be left behind. Now, let me give you kind of an overview before I introduce the members of the panel. Each of you should have a packet. Now, you don't have to read it all right now. This is more for your ready reference. But in that packet, you will have bios of the speakers. You will also have information on some of the things that have been noted. For example, the December 18th press release from USDA talking about monies in this year's budget, not the one that's held up by the government shutdown and the wall controversy, but this year's budget. And then you also have materials from the Wolf administration that talk about the Pennsylvania Broadband Initiative. Now, I don't want to upstage our speaker in any way, shape, or form, but what I really liked about the information that I saw was why high-speed internet access is important. To me, that sounded like a rural citizens' Bill of Rights when it comes to internet access where there is insufficient access today. So when you kind of go through your packet, please read the Bill of Rights dealing with business, dealing with health care, dealing with education. Now, having said all that, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to introduce each member of the panel, and please applaud freely after each one if you would like, to give kind of a texture and kind of a perspective, and then I will turn it over to each of the panelists to make a presentation. And then, of course, open it up for dialogue, for conversation. Now, and there were some conversations, though, as to which panelist should go first. And a quiet conspiracy said that Steve Samara, since he wasn't in the room at the time, might be the first speaker today. But, of course, I can't be sure. Okay. Now, there is, however, a casualty. Kurt Kalkadrilli is the Director of Rural Development for USDA. Broadband is a key interest of his. He comes from near Homesdale, so that tells you a lot about some of the personal access issues that he may have seen himself and his neighbors as well. But he is a casualty of the government shutdown. And he sent an email saying that he wanted to wish this group very well and pursue endeavors. And he said when he can kind of get back on the clock, he would love to help everybody do the thing that we all are united in wanting to do. So I wanted to give you best regards from Kurt. Now, in terms of Sherry Collins, and of course you've got a detailed bio on her, but I want to hit you a couple of highlights that kind of came to the fore. First of all, she is the Deputy Secretary of Technology and Innovation at the Department of Community and Economic Development. This is a position she's held since 2004, but she was also at DCED responsible for administering the Keystone Innovation Zone program. And she's previously the Executive Director of the Technology Investment Office. Now, that has an awful lot to do with today's topic, because if you don't have the investment or the capability to attract investment, then really this whole discussion becomes kind of esoteric and something that academics would read about, but not really guaranteeing the results that may be warranted by that investment. But her whole background is small business economic development, and she also managed economic investment for the state employees retirement system, and overall 25 years economic development and private investment. Now, of course, she is beginning to focus some of her efforts on the issue that we are all concerned about today in terms of broadband access. So, please help me welcome Sherry. Now, Betsy Huber. Betsy is the president of the National Grange. Now, what that means is that she gets a national perspective. She gets to talk to people from all across America. And the universal thing that is brought to her mind is that this has to be a priority. And towards that end, she was appointed to the FCC Broadband Deployment Advisory Board. So if you want to get inside the FCC crystal ball, she tells me to tell people to look elsewhere. Did I get that right, Betsy? Okay. But the thing about it is, though, it's nice to have someone who is part of an FCC advisory group to focus on broadband, someone to give us maybe a national perspective when needed. Now, some other things in her background. Of course, a native Pennsylvanian. She is also the past president of the Pennsylvania State Grange, and also the lobbyist for the Pennsylvania State Grange. And I have to tell you, even though I'm the lobbyist for the Grange now, Betsy had an awful lot to do with me wanting to be the lobbyist of the Grange, because she approached her task in dealing with public officials with such grace and humility that I thought I would like to work for a group of people that engender that characteristic in their lobbyist. So I wanted to thank you for being an inspiration to me as well. And if you would, please, recognize Betsy. Now, Kristen Phillips-Hill. She is the new state senator from York County. She was elected in 2018. She is the former state representative from the Dallastown area of York County. Now, her interest in broadband is, I think, a very interesting story, and she'll probably tell you more about it. But when I first talked to her about this, she referenced her years as a school district director, when people would come to her and say, my kids have to do their homework, but I have to drive to the school parking lot in order to give them the internet access that they have to have in order to do the program, in order to do their homework, in order to be competitive, in order to be effective leaders of tomorrow. Now, you told me a lot of other things too, and I don't want you to think I didn't retain everything else you said as well. But the fact of the matter is that genesis really speaks for her interest in this issue. Now, as a state representative, what she and Democrat Pam Snyder put together was the Rural Broadband Caucus. Now, she did this in September of last year. And hopefully, Pam Snyder and some of her colleagues that are still in the House will continue it. I've spoken with her privacy, no pressure here. But I would love to see her be the springboard for a Senate broadband caucus as well. But so suffice it to say that Senator Kristen Phillips-Hill, this is really a key issue for her. I also wanted to point out that she's already issued sponsorship memo, and a copy of her sponsorship memo is in your packet. So you can see some of the things she's proposing, although doubtless she will speak to them as well. So, Kristen? And now, our first speaker. Steve likes this already, I can see. Steve Samara has a really an interesting background. First of all, he's worked with the Pennsylvania Telephone Association for 22 years. Now think about it. That's a couple of decades of working in the trenches to make sure that Pennsylvania's telephone companies are viable economically, and also to make sure that they are responsive to the needs of the people who live in underserved areas. So in other words, I probably could change his name to Stephen Broadband Initiative, and that would not be too far from the point. Now, I have to tell you that he was vice president for 11 years. He's been the president of the Pennsylvania Telephone Association since 2008. Before that, since everybody in this line of work reincarnates from time to time, he was the executive director for the Senate committee dealing with communications and high technology. So he certainly has a legislative side to his background as well. Now, a little story. When I first started talking to Steve about the panel last year, I said, "Oh, you live in New Cumberland." And he said, "Well, you know, it's funny about New Cumberland. All the maps show us as having full broadband access, but that's not necessarily the case, because you will have situations where folks have broadband, but you go a few hundred yards and the next house has nothing." And so I thought that example kind of illustrated some of the problems that we've had to deal with. And so, with no further ado, let us welcome Steve. And now our first presenter.
You come in late one time. I didn't get picked for any Grange committees or to take minutes on anything, did I? Because I wasn't here first. Minutes are the worst. I hate taking minutes. So
All will be revealed to you at the proper time.
I'm not sure. Thanks, Vince. And thank you to the Grange for putting this together again. It's still very relevant, as we all know. I appreciate the invite last year, and things have changed quite a bit in a year. Maybe not for all of you, and for some who are still wanting to get more speed or wanting to get broadband, but we've been working very hard, and I think you'll hear from the rest of the panelists that they're doing the same thing. Just by way of background, the PTA does represent all of the RLECs, or the Rural Local Exchange Carriers in Pennsylvania. That means all of your local landline companies except for Verizon. We don't represent Verizon, and they are not a rural local exchange carrier by definition. So we represent all the folks who 100 years ago or so decided, and many of them were farmers, honestly, that wanted service from Ma Bell and couldn't get it. So a lot of my members sprung up from the necessity to have basic voice service many years ago. So those are the folks I represent. There's about 30 of them across the state. There's some larger ones, but not large in the grand scheme of things, the CenturyLinks, the Windstreams, the Consolidateds. And then there's a pretty big gap between those and some kind of mom and pop operations that have just several thousand access lines in rural parts of the Commonwealth. So that's my membership group. What has changed since last time I was here? Well, we're still investing. We're still investing in rural broadband. It is expensive, as you all know. We are now reaching the parts of the Commonwealth that, while they do have 1.544 megabits, because statutorily they are required to have that under Act 183, which was passed in 2004, they don't have, they're not statutory, there's no statutory requirements to go beyond that, but my member companies have gone way beyond that speed. I often get snickers from folks when I say 1.544 meg, but 2004, that was the standard of broadband. It changes all the time, and we'll talk a little bit about what is the definition of broadband. But we've gone way beyond that. We continue to improve broadband access, and as we'll hear a little bit later on again, this is an expensive proposition. You know, the USDA has done some great work, and there is money flowing out to the states to do this. But it is a billion-dollar proposition to get to 100 meg in Pennsylvania, not a $1 million proposition. That's a B and not an M. So it's a big deal to get all that that bandwidth out to folks. So we're still investing. We are active as an association with the FCC and with the USDA. I'm disappointed Mr. Cook really couldn't be here, but you will hear from others that they are doing their level best to get money out to the states to do broadband deployment. The $600 million e-connectivity program is something that the PTA signed on to and advocated for, to get money to trickle down to the states to get broadband out there to the rural parts of the Commonwealth, and we're very active at that area, to try and pry as much money as we can out from the feds to get it down to the states to get this done. We're also very active with the Pennsylvania PUC, and the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission has been at the forefront of a couple things you may not put in the bucket of broadband necessarily, but a couple dockets that the PUC has teed up are very important to us. One is a look at, from a regulatory perspective, how we deal with our traditional landline companies. My folks, the landline companies, are the only fully regulated portion of the telecommunications industry. Cable is not regulated at the state level. Wireless is not regulated at the state level. We still have the burden and the cost associated with it of regulations that are sometimes decades old. And there is a cost associated with doing that. You know, we still follow all the reports. We are carriers of last resort, which means if someone moves into an area and wants dial tone, we have to go there. My member companies have to go there. No one else has to. There's a cost associated with that. So we filed comments with the PUC and said, hey, let's modernize our regs. That would save us some money. That would free up some revenue that we could use to help deploy broadband, because broadband, as we mentioned, is an expensive proposition. The other docket that the PUC has teed up is dealing with pole attachments. Commissioner Norm Kennard has kind of been leading the effort on that. And it's, well, what does that have to do with deploying rural broadband? Well, you got to get on the poles to get the network there to get the broadband deployed. And if you're not the pole owner, you have to negotiate with the pole owner to get on the poles so you can get the broadband deployed. Sometimes that's very expensive. And so the PUC has opened an investigation to look at how we can streamline the ability of folks who want to provide broadband to get on these poles so they can deploy the network, that broadband can get out to the rural parts of the Commonwealth. So both of those dockets are still pending. We're actively involved in both of them, and I think they'll go a long way to helping us get broadband out in a more efficient way to the rural parts of the Commonwealth. We have also been working for the past couple sessions on Pennsylvania Universal Service Fund legislation, and actually Betsy was the first of the third-party folks that we went to many years ago to talk about how we keep basic service affordable in Pennsylvania. You don't get all the bells and whistles of broadband if you don't have that network that's there to deploy it, and that's what the Pennsylvania Universal Service Fund helps support. It is that traditional legacy landline network that is there, that helps wireless calls connect, that helps broadband work. So we have tried for the past couple sessions, and we'll be trying again in this next session, to at least keep the universal service funding available to my member companies so they can do not only affordable voice service, but the broadband in the rural parts of the Commonwealth. And I want to give props to Betsy for, she was the first, and the Grange was the first third party to sign on to that legislation years ago, because she and the Grange recognized that we also need basic affordable voice service in rural parts of the state in order to get the broadband. So thank you to Betsy for being the first one on board. And the Grange has been on board with every effort since then, and we expect with this legislation that we're working on now that they will be supportive as well. We've also worked with the Governor's Broadband Office and Sherry. Sherry and I talk probably way more than she wants to, but she asked for my opinion a couple months ago, and I was happy to give it to her. So she's under the burden of listening to me squawk about all this stuff as well on a weekly basis, certainly. But the Governor's Office, as Sherry will tell you, has been proactive in this broadband effort, and we look forward to continuing to work with them and see what we can get done to solve this challenge. So Vince also mentioned the House Broadband Caucus. I'll let Senator Phillips-Hill talk a little bit about that, but I think you'll be pleased what you hear from her. She's not because she's changed chambers, is not deciding to do different things. She is going to keep after this effort hot and heavy, and Chris and I met a couple weeks ago, and we want to be part of that effort and see if we can find some way to solve that problem. And again, I think you'll see from the PTA another effort to introduce legislation that tries to address the rural broadband problem, which will include something preserving the Pennsylvania USF and some sort of mechanism, some sort of way to get funding to make this a business case for these rural carriers. And that's really what it boils down to. I mean, it sounds crass, but you got to make a business case for folks, the RLECs, to get out there. We're going to talk a little bit about what these companies have faced as far as deploying broadband, investing the money to do it, and how many people actually subscribe to the service. This notion that if you build it, they will come is just a notion. You don't get everyone signing up for broadband, and you don't get them at the speeds that you think that are out there, that are, whether it's 25 meg or 100 meg, as the governor has put out there. So, you know, we need to work with my member companies, I think, to kind of focus in on areas of the Commonwealth where we really know there's a need for it, and you can make a business case for it. But we'll talk a little about that further. So, without any further ado, we'll turn it back over to you, Vince.
Okay. I would point out that the Pennsylvania State Grange has taken a very strong position in favor of legislation that would continue the Universal Service Fund. So, to kind of reinforce what you said. And now that's kind of a nice segue, because he referenced some of the things that the Senator is doing, and so I would turn the program to you.
Thank you very much, Vince, and thank you to the Pennsylvania Grange and Debbie's husband, Wayne, for inviting me to join you all here this morning to talk about an issue of great importance to the people that I represent. And really, to me, this is, as Steve referenced, been a bit of a journey. It started back when I was on the school board in Dallastown, and I had a neighbor who actually came over one of the farms and would park in my driveway so that her daughter could access turnitin.com, which for those of you who don't have a child who's in school, if your kid writes a paper today, they can turn it in to turnitin.com and the teacher will know if there's been any plagiarism. Kind of a cool thing. So when Vince emailed me and he asked if I'd be interested in being part of this panel this morning and taking part in this conversation, assessing the progress that we've made on rural broadband, I immediately said yes. And the reason I said yes was I thought it would be incredibly productive and very useful. One of the things that I have found in my short but eventful tenure in Harrisburg is that at times being in the legislature can feel like you're in that movie Groundhog Day. You know the classic 90s movie with Bill Murray, and he's the TV weatherman. He's headed out to Punxsutawney to cover all of those exciting things that happen in Punxsutawney on Groundhog's Day, and he gets stuck in this time loop. And he repeatedly relives the same day. And for a lot of issues in Harrisburg, that's the reality. And the good news is that closing the digital divide doesn't appear to be one of them. It's been over 2 years now since I had all of these complaints from parents. And actually, as difficult as it was, Vince, in Dallastown, it's even worse when you get down to Kennerdale in Southeastern School District, right along the Mason-Dixon line. So I wrote an editorial for the York Daily Record, and I entitled it Closing Pennsylvania's Digital Divide. And I reviewed the promises that had been made, and for some people, they believe promises that had been broken with regard to the legislation and the pledges that were made to make high-speed internet available to everyone in our Commonwealth. And that editorial became a call to arms to address this critical issue here in our Commonwealth. And I think that that call has been answered across this Commonwealth, really at every level of government. We have seen efforts in Washington, D.C., at the White House, in the halls of Congress, at the FCC, where Betsy has done a stellar job representing Pennsylvania. Here in the legislature, in the governor's office, you know, it was just a year ago when Sherry's predecessor said that, you know, this really isn't something that we're going to see addressed until 2019 when the governor gets reelected. And I remember saying, really, are you kidding me? And not that long after, the governor started his broadband initiative, set up that office, and we've seen a commitment, and I really appreciate that. You know, we're seeing efforts in all 67 counties, in municipalities all across the Commonwealth and in our school districts. And businesses, large and small, advocacy groups, utility industry, everybody's at the table, and we are seeing progress. So make no mistake, lack of high-speed internet access is still an impediment to our students. And the digital divide in rural Pennsylvania still limits our economic opportunities for our small businesses, for our farmers. It inhibits our emergency service providers. You know, the York County 911 system went down, and when that happens, all of our emergency responders are using cell phone-based apps or on the internet. And when you don't have great access to high-speed internet, and let me tell you, you get down into a lot of my territory in southern York County, good luck getting a cell phone signal. So it impedes them. You know, telemedicine is the future of healthcare, and especially for our rural Pennsylvanians. And if you don't have access to high-speed internet, you don't have access to a doctor. But the change is going to come. And so I'd like to talk about where I'm seeing progress. One of those places I'm seeing progress is data. So the decisions that you make are only as good as the information that you base those decisions on. And when we gathered to discuss this issue last year, we were still using a number 800,000 residents in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania don't have access to high-speed internet. And I would say that there are 25,000 people in York County who don't have that access. And that's the number of people that we truly believed to not have access to high-speed internet. And I would say that thanks to the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, Steve may disagree with me, and that's okay, and their investment into a year-long study that focused on the availability and the cost of internet access, over 5 million tests have revealed that only a small portion of Pennsylvania meets the FCC's minimum standard for broadband. So Steve referenced what the Pennsylvania standard is, 1.544 megabytes per second, and I don't like to get wonky because I think people get lost in the numbers, but the FCC's minimum speed for broadband is 25.3 megabytes per second. So the research was conducted by Penn State University's renowned technology policy expert, Sasha Meinrath, and decision makers at every level now have real and meaningful numbers to base our decisions. So the number of people without access or have a discrepancy in actual speeds versus advertised speeds is in the millions. Marginal broadband connectivity is a Commonwealth-wide problem. And this issue is bigger than just rural Pennsylvania. I know we're here at the Farm Show, and the Grange is really an advocate for rural Pennsylvanians. But this isn't just a rural problem. It is truly a Pennsylvania problem. So that leads us to our next area of progress, and that was the formation of the House Broadband Caucus. So looking across the aisle, I partnered with my good friend and colleague, Democratic State Representative Pam Snyder, and she serves, if you traverse all the way across the Mason-Dixon line, all the way west, 3 of the Commonwealth's most southwestern counties, and that's Fayette, Greene, and Washington. And with regard to increasing internet availability, Pam is a legislative colleague equally as committed to solving this problem. And her district is even more rural than mine, and it's peppered with more of what I call holes in that alleged blanket of internet coverage. And we formed the House Broadband Caucus, and we held our first meeting in September of 2018, and we put all the stakeholders in one room together, including the Grange, the Farm Bureau. Steve was there, Sherry was there, everyone was there. And we had presentations from the governor's office, from the Department of Community and Economic Development, and from the PUC. And the Broadband Caucus is going to continue this session in the House. And with my transition to the Senate, Representative Snyder and I are looking forward to making it bicameral. So we're not just going to have a House caucus and a Senate caucus. We're looking to bring all of those players together. And then I would say we're looking at passage of legislation. In the General Assembly, strength is always in numbers. It is the key to getting legislation passed to solve problems, and Representative Snyder and I are reintroducing legislation from last session in both the House and the Senate. So keep an eye out. I'm not sure the House co-sponsor memos have dropped yet, but they will be there. So you have them in your packet. Really briefly, one will be to conduct an in-depth investigation and audit into the compliance of non-rural telecommunication carriers with Act 67 of 1993 and Act 183 of 2004. The next would establish a special bipartisan bicameral legislative commission to recommend deployments of high-speed broadband services in unserved and underserved areas, how we can improve what we're doing, because I'm sure Sherry will talk about this, but there's a lot we know and there's a lot that we don't know. So, and the last would be an inventory of all State Department agency, commission, or institution-owned communication towers, poles, buildings, and facilities to leverage existing state-owned assets for the provisioning of high-speed broadband internet to unserved and underserved areas. So in 2018, we're going to continue to push for passage of the above bills and proactively seek other initiatives and opportunities to bring high-speed broadband internet accessibility to all Pennsylvanians. So the good news is that the recently signed Farm Bill, combined with better data collection about rural broadband coverage, will really assist policymakers as well as private sector entities who want to make investments to close that rural broadband gap. And government at every level really has to work together to assure a positive environment for making rural broadband access a reality. So on my side of the General Assembly, I'm hearing really positive messages. Senator Wayne Langerholk is the new chairman of the Senate Technology and Communications Committee. And when he put out his press release, he said, this is one of the issues that the committee's going to address. I was stopped in the hallway of the Senate earlier this week by Senator Art Haywood of Philadelphia. And he took the time to have a really nice conversation with me, sharing his interest in the broadband issue. And when Representative Snyder and I formed the Broadband Caucus, we thought about calling it the Rural Broadband Caucus, but we recognized that, as successful as many of the initiatives for the 8 years of the Obama administration in closing that digital divide between the haves and the have-nots, and knowing it really exposed this digital divide between rural and non-rural areas, there might be some work that we all need to do and circle back once we fix our rural problems. So I'm very happy that that decision was made by Representative Snyder and I'm very hopeful when I hear from senators from Philadelphia that this is an issue. And, I, again, have to thank the Grange because this is a great opportunity for me, for all of us, to listen to all of you and better understand what you are experiencing on the ground so we can do a better job of legislating, policy making, and for Steve investing in the Commonwealth and fixing one of the greatest problems that you face, and that is the lack of accessibility to high-speed internet service. So again, thank you, and I will turn it back to Vince.
Thank you. That does remind me of a conversation that I had with State Representative Chris Rabb at the Ag Progress Days last summer. He's a Democrat from southeastern Pennsylvania, and he was saying that there are many parts of urban America and Pennsylvania that are just as without access as rural areas. So to reinforce what you said, and it does remind me of the reason farm bills get passed is that you have urban legislators who care strongly about nutrition programs and agricultural interests who care about farming issues unite, and that's how you get the numbers. And it may well be that we'll have kind of an urban-rural interface to get some of these measures passed. So I wanted to thank you very much for making that connection. Now, here's a segue. One thing that I don't think I mentioned, and Kristen didn't either, is that she is also on an FCC advisory body. If I'm not mistaken, it's the Advisory Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs. She is the only Pennsylvanian on that, which means that we are blessed with two folks on FCC committees. Now, Betsy Huber, of course, is the other one, and of course, reference some of the things that she's done at the national level. So, Betsy, could you give a little bit of what's going on nationally and some of the things that perhaps the National Grange is working on to help meet this goal?
Sure. Thank you, Vince. As Vince has told you, I'm on the FCC Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. That was formed by Chairman Pai in January of 2017. And they received applications through the next couple months, and the appointments were made by late March. Our first meeting was April 21st in 2017, and we've met 7 times in DC and hundreds of times by conference calls through the period up till now. Originally, there were 5 working groups that were formed by members of the BDAC, we call it, plus others added to the groups for more resource information. The 5 groups were competitive access to broadband infrastructure, removing state and local regulatory barriers, a model municipal code, a model state code, and streamlining federal siting. So those were the original 5. I was appointed to the Model State Code Committee Working Group and the Streamlining Federal Siting Group. And then in January 2018 was added a working group on fees, just to look at all of the fees involved. And then in November, another working group was established on disaster response and recovery. So everything that we've done is available on the FCC website. It's fcc.gov/broadband-deployment-advisory-committee. So it's all there, all of our drafts, all of the approved reports, and everything you can see there. The BDAC was an interesting group. It was originally 30 people, and there's been a few added since then. A lot of providers, a lot of industry people, all facets of the industry involved in broadband, and quite a few government officials and representatives from cities, municipalities, up to state internet offices. So it was quite a learning curve for me, because I did not know any of the technical information about broadband and internet, but I've certainly learned a lot, a whole new vocabulary. The barriers group identified a list of what they saw as general barriers. And I'll just quickly run through them. This report's available on the website. Ambiguity, which applications, procedures can be arbitrary, unclear, unreasonable in trying to get a project approved for broadband deployment. Discrimination may be different fees for different companies. Insufficient transparency. Excessive fees. They could be unreasonably high. They could be duplicating fees that are already paid. Lots of problems with fees. Inflexibility. Broadband internet is changing so rapidly that if you pass an ordinance with certain requirements in it, it may be out of date by next year, so it's hard to keep up with the advancing technologies. Inordinance, that means conditions or requirements put forward by a municipality are unreasonable or overly burdensome. And then non-compliance, when the state or local authority fails to enforce or comply with their own established rules. So those are the barriers, just generally, that working group decided. The Model Municipal Code set forth, these are all recommendations. Everything that we did are just recommendations to the FCC. In order to put them into effect, it has to go through the normal FCC process of notice and publishing in the register and time period and all of that to get through into regulation. So ours are just simply recommendations, but the FCC has already started to put some of them in through the regulatory process, so that's a good thing, I think. In our model municipal code, we recommended that an administrative review and permits only would be required for co-location of a small wireless facility, modification of a pole, for co-location, construction of a new pole or monopole tower, up to a certain height. And construction of a communications facility involving fiber optic or other cable. So those less invasive, less involved projects should only require an administrative review and a permit, not a full-blown zoning procedure. We talked a lot about shot clocks, which is a new term. That's deadlines. So a municipality would have 20 days to determine if an application was complete. And if it's incomplete, they must identify what's missing, and the applicant can resubmit that same application within 20 days with no further charges. There seem to be a lot of objections and problems with providers just with time, the time it takes to get through an approval process with a municipality. Time is money. So we're trying to facilitate that whole permit and review process to make the providers more willing to deploy in areas that are not served, and to just save money and put the money into the actual facilities instead of permit time. The municipality would have 60 days to approve or deny the application after it's complete for co-location, or 90 days for a new structure. Of course, the municipality has to advise the provider in writing of their final decision and specifically identify the code provisions that if they're going to deny the application, why. And the applicant can cure those deficiencies and have 30 days to resubmit without an additional application fee. And then the municipality has 30 days to act on the resubmitted application. If they fail to act, if the municipality fails to act in the review period, the applicant can notify the municipality that the time has lapsed, and then they are deemed approved. So it's a real incentive to municipalities to get the job done within a time period, or the provider will be deemed approved and can proceed with the project. I was a township supervisor for 24 years, so I know all about deemed approval. And that's definitely an incentive to move through the process. And so we're hoping that this shot clock provision will help move things along. Steve talked some about pole attachments. That was another big issue. And we came up with some rules for make-ready provisions. Make-ready is the process of getting the pole or the facility ready to receive another attachment. If one company owns a pole and somebody else wants to attach to that same pole, which the municipality would like rather than having multiple poles, we're trying to make that process faster, easier for all the parties. We made provisions for batch applications. If somebody is putting small cell wireless in a municipality and there's several hundred of these attachments, we're enabling them to be approved in batches of applications, again, to speed up the process. Another term that was used a lot is dig once. Rather than, we've all seen road projects where it's trenched repeatedly, once for the electric wires, once for the telephone wires, the cable. makes so much sense to dig once and put all of the underground cabling in at one time, in one conduit, if possible. The state model code committee that I worked on, we spent a lot of time on definitions. If you haven't worked in municipal government, or I guess state government too, definitions are very important. They can change the meaning of the whole zoning ordinance by the definition. So one definition we came up with was make ready, which I just talked about. It means the transfer, relocation, rearrangement, or alteration of a pre-existing third-party user's communication equipment, antenna, line, or facility of any kind necessary to provide space for an attacher to install an attachment. We spent hours on our telephone meetings on a definition of rural. So rural, for this purpose, means if not otherwise defined by a state, county, or by the state. Rural is a county with an average population density of less than 300 persons per square mile, excluding the incorporated communities of 20,000 people or greater within the county, so usually the county seat. And another definition was broadband. That can have many definitions, even in federal government. Broadband, for our purpose, was any high-speed telecommunications capability that enables users to originate and receive high-quality voice, data, graphics, and video telecommunications using any transmission media or technology, at a minimum, shall meet the definition of advanced telecommunications capacity as determined by the FCC from time to time, except in unserved or rural areas where, at a minimum, it shall meet the definition by the FCC, regardless of technology. Latency that does not exceed 100 milliseconds round trip, and minimum usage allowance of 150 gigabytes per month. Generally, we were talking about the 25.3 that the senator referenced. Our state code also had provisions to require any new infrastructure construction to be broadband ready. Requires any new multi-tenant buildings to have network access points and be broadband ready. So we're looking toward the future, again, digging once, having a building, an apartment building, fitted out for broadband access when it's being built. And we have separate rules for the small wireless facilities, the 5G, the small cells that are coming to the fore right now. And they would be allowed by right in any zoning district. We established or recommended, now our state model code and municipal code are like a cafeteria plan. We set out all these provisions, and if a state would like to adopt the code, they can pick and choose what sections they want. So one of our recommendations is a Rural Broadband Deployment Assistance Fund. And it states that every provider of communication services in the state shall contribute to the Rural Broadband Deployment Assistance Fund in an equitable and non-discriminatory manner. And also, every provider of communication services and broadband dependent services shall contribute. So broadband dependent services are things like Netflix, who do not pay to the fund right now. So this is a big deal to those providers that were on our BDAC. They certainly benefit economically from having access to the broadband, so we felt that they should contribute through the Universal Fund or Universal Service Fund or this assistance fund to helping deploy the service out to the unserved areas. And we do talk about the State Universal Service Fund and that communication service providers shall be eligible for grants from the fund. For the make-ready provisions for attaching to poles, we recommend using a list of pre-approved contractors. So if one provider owns the pole and another provider wants to attach, there can be that third party, that neutral contractor who can actually do the attachment, that the pole owner who may not have time to get the attachment or the facilities moved so that the new provider can attach, so that can happen faster. Again, to save time and get the deployment done. Lots more technical stuff that I won't go over now. It was a very interesting experience serving on this committee, and lots of controversy between providers and municipalities and everybody protecting their side of the industry. But all of us were there for the purpose of providing the service, of getting the service out there to everyone who wanted it, to improve the economy for all the reasons that have already been talked about. So,
I have to tell you that years ago, I worked at USDA. And one of my first responsibilities was to draft a memo from the Secretary of Agriculture about the wonders of voluntarism. They decided to give it to a committee. A year later, we had the approval for the rough draft of that document. Now, the takeaway here, in relevance to what Betsy said, is, and also to what the Senator said, is that I guess if you are a member of a federal committee, patience is truly a virtue. But I'm impressed with the work that's been done, and I'm impressed with the recommendations that have come forth. Now the question is, what do you do with all these recommendations? Because at the state level, there's been meetings with stakeholders, et cetera, that we've talked about. But what are we going to do in Pennsylvania? And to explain the approach taken by the Wolf administration and possibly charting forward, Sherry?
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't ask you to applaud Betsy's, I'm sorry. Pardon my bad manners. Sherry?
Thank you, Vince. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Vince for allowing me to be here today. This is certainly a pleasure and an honor to be able to share with you what the Wolf administration is doing relative to Pennsylvania's broadband initiative. As the Senator mentioned earlier, this office was launched last year after Governor Wolf had taken a trip, I think it was above Route 6 perhaps, and recognized firsthand some of the inadequacies in the broadband coverage available not only to our citizens but to our businesses. And it was that particular trip that really fueled the fire for him to say, this is a serious issue. And so the governor launched the office, and we have been moving forward. We have been making some progress over the last year, and I am happy to report that I will continue to help champion this effort. As Vince had mentioned earlier, I am the Deputy Secretary for the Office of Technology and Innovation at Pennsylvania's Department of Community and Economic Development. It is quite a mouthful, but as Betsy said, in state government and federal government and municipalities, there's all these acronyms and definitions, so I like to say I'm the DepSec of DCD's Tech and Innovation Office. It just makes it a lot easier. What I'm not responsible for at the department is working on state agencies' printer problems. Oftentimes I get phone calls. I'm having a problem with my Ricoh copier. Good. Call the IT department. That's not me. I have had for the last 14 years the opportunity to work at the department and focus on a number of initiatives that really support Pennsylvania's innovators and entrepreneurs. And as Vince had mentioned in my bio, and I'm not sure where you got that one, it's a little outdated, but it's okay. I am now 32 years strong in state government and proudly serve in this current capacity. And one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do over the last 4 years as the Deputy Secretary of this office is work as the Governor's State Alternate on the Appalachian Regional Commission. And that commission is vitally important to addressing some of the broadband infrastructure challenges that we are having in Pennsylvania. Just this week, the ARC, not impacted, by the way, by the federal government shutdown, launched an RFP for which they are now accepting proposals for the Power Grant Initiative. And this Power Initiative is designed to support those communities in Pennsylvania that have been impacted by the downturn in the coal industry. And so part of the $45 million initiative provides a carve-out of $15 million for broadband infrastructure development and deployment. And so Pennsylvania is one of 13 states that is part of the ARC program. And in Pennsylvania, we have 52 counties that are ARC designated. So we look forward to working with our community partners, working with our economic development partners, the local development districts, and organizations such as the Pennsylvania Grange and our partners at the Department of Agriculture to really tease out some good opportunities for applications to be submitted to the ARC for this funding. That is a really unique opportunity that we have in Pennsylvania. And as the Gov State Alternate, I am extremely excited to see what Pennsylvania puts forth for that. This is a good opportunity for us at the moment. I had my own notes, and then as I listened to the speakers, started taking their notes, and now I'm not really sure where I am in my thought process, but I think it is very clear to say this morning that all of us that sit at this table and all of you that are in this room are very passionate about the challenges that we have in Pennsylvania as it relates to this broadband infrastructure. I want to thank Steve personally, not just for going first, but for his support over the last couple months. I've been pinch hitting in this capacity since October, wearing dual hats, and you have been an amazing resource for me, and I greatly appreciate it. Truth be told, I told Vince last night on the phone that I was going to pull rank and have Steve go first today. So that's really what happened. I don't get to pull rank anywhere else, so I thought I would try it here. Seems to have worked to my advantage. The senator and I have enjoyed opportunities to chat over the last couple of years about this initiative as well, and so I'm really excited to have you in the Senate and put a renewed focus and emphasis on this challenge. The Governor's Office of Broadband Initiatives over the past year has been able to accomplish some things. Some of you are probably very familiar with the FCC's CAF2 initiative, the Connect America Fund, where Pennsylvania providers had an opportunity to bid on funds through the federal government, through the FCC. We were successful in having 3 providers actually receive some of those funds, and through the Department of Transportation, there was some additional funding available of $35 million to really help carry out this initiative. So there was mention earlier to Tri-County Rural Electric Cooperative, which will cover Potter, Tioga, Lycoming, and Bradford counties. They were the largest recipient of funds through the CAF2 auction, pardon me. Armstrong Telephone Company will cover Erie, Crawford, and Mercer County, and then VelocityNet is located in Erie, and they too are a participant in this. So we're looking forward to working with those 3 providers to really roll out their programs and see how this can be impactful. Over the next couple months, you're going to see a lot more information become available on the governor's page in the Office of Broadband Initiatives in particular. So I would encourage you to stay tuned and continue to look back for updates there. Again, I think one of the things that we get caught up on in the conversation is that this is a $1 billion effort. And it is. It's huge. It's It's a huge opportunity. It's a huge initiative. There's a lot of work that needs to go into it, but I think what we have right now in Pennsylvania, again, is this renewed spirit and this collaborative engagement that we're seeing across the aisles with the governor's office, with our partner organizations to really want to get something done. I look across the room, I see some folks here that have been working on this initiative for a couple years, certainly Dave Bonzik and Kelly Lewis and their teams. And these two individuals have been huge champions for this. And so we look forward to continuing to work with the two of you and your teams as we continue to advance this effort. So again, check back on the governor's website next week. You may see some updates there that you might find surprising on Monday. And with that, I will close out my comments. But again, want to thank you all for allowing me to be here today and to talk about what the governor's office is doing with this very important initiative. Thank you.
Well, hearing of your title and how you abbreviated it, I've got another abbreviation. Why don't we just call you the Broadband Czar?
Oh.
And that's not going to take quite as much room on the business card, but it'll kind of get the job done.
That's an interesting one, Vince.
Yeah, non-committal, I noticed, but that's okay. All right, what I'd like to do is open it for discussion, but I would like to kind of get the ball rolling by asking the first question of the panel. An awful lot of confusion comes about in terms of knowing who regulates what. So I wanted to ask you if you could kind of walk us through that. What does the federal government regulate? What does the state government regulate? And what powers does municipal government have to influence whatever edicts come down on high? If I could ask you all to address that, and then we'll open up for the attendees to start some dialogue.
Sure. Watch this. This is how this works, right? This is an easy pass. I'm going to look down the table and ask the other members of the panel to address that. I am relatively new to the broadband effort. And so I'm driving around Harrisburg and surrounding areas across the Commonwealth for the last 2 months, literally looking at cell towers, looking at telephone lines, trying to figure out, make ready, and all these other things. So I know what I know and I know what I don't know. So I'm going to pass it. How's that?
Sitting in the wrong spot again. There has been a huge debate at the federal level about whether internet service providers and information services should fall under the bailiwick of traditional regulation. And if you've heard about net neutrality, that debate is going on at the federal level with the FCC. The FCC has been smack dab in the middle of kind of pulling back, regulating those carriers. So for the most part at this point in time, your internet service providers are not regulated by the federal government. At the state level, as I mentioned in my opening comments, wireless carriers are not regulated by our PUC, neither are cable TV providers. They do regulate my member companies, which are the traditional landline companies. So that's a simple way, Vince, of answering who's regulated by who. And if you talk to FCC Chairman Pai at the federal level, matter of fact, he just put out a news release a couple days ago saying that because internet service providers are unregulated, are lesser regulated at the federal level, they have invested a lot of money into the marketplace and are doing the things that they can do to get broadband out to everybody. So it's that age-old debate of how important regulation is to keep customers safe and give them some protections, as opposed to allowing companies to invest, be more nimble, and put money into deploying broadband throughout the country and throughout Pennsylvania. So that docket that the PUC opened on Chapter 63 and 64 is at the crux of Vince's question, which is, do we regulate the landline companies the way we always have, or does it make sense in a brand new modern society with all the changes that have happened over the past couple decades to allow them to be more nimble, to allow them to go out and price things accordingly, not have to file all the reports at the PUC that we traditionally have, and allow them to go out and compete and get broadband out there more efficiently.
I would say that's a very accurate summary of where we are. And there's also some confusion when we start getting into the pole attachments. I know that Norm Kennard has been a huge advocate that there are federal regulations for that. Municipalities have oversight, and the state's trying to figure out a better way, because we know that further deployment is going to be dependent on getting these small cell sites out into the local communities, and that we need to figure out a way to do it so it's a more efficient, more effective process, not as costly and not as time consuming. So I think we're still working on that. And with regard to telemedicine, you know, Betsy did a great job talking about the BDAC and where federal efforts are. I can tell you on the Intergovernmental Advisory Committee on which I sit, telemedicine has been one of the big charges, and how do we get rid of regulatory barriers for implementing this new technology. And so there are some things that we need to do here in Pennsylvania to make that a better service for all Pennsylvanians. So we are looking at that both at the federal level and at the state level.
I would just add that the application process for deployment actually happens at the municipal level. So that's why we concentrated so much on the model state code, model municipal code, because just in my county, I live in Chester County, southeast Pennsylvania, we have 73 different municipalities in the county. And a provider that wants to deploy maybe a 20-mile stretch of one highway could go through 3 or 4 different municipalities and have to go through an application process in every one, totally different. So that's what we're trying to address to make deployment easier, to make the application process easier.
And Sherry wisely says nothing right now. What can I say? Okay. No, let's have some interaction, sir.
Yeah, I'm from Crawford County, and I get the rural prospectus about thing that comes out, and it had in there in the November, December issue, to take the broadband speed test, and you went to www.broadband.us/. Well, I passed that on to some friends of mine that they're supposed to get 12 or whatever it is, and if they only get like 1, he said, when I go on, try to go on and do the speed test, I can't do it because it won't run. And I said, well, that's kind of ironic. But anyways, I guess my question is, I have not heard anything about this broadband speed test to know what kind of results they come from that. That was the November, December issue, and I know that's very recent, but it didn't say in the article how long they were going to do the speed test.
Please.
Well, first off, thank you for spreading that. One of the around to your friends and your neighbors, because we were all working very hard to push that study out, because we needed people from all across the state to do it. And that was one of the questions I asked. So what happens if you have no access? And they said, we'll be able to see that, and we'll be able to know that there's no access there. So that's a good thing. The broadband research project was done at Penn State University, and they issued a preliminary report in November of 2018, and in the next couple of months we should see the conclusion of that report and get the full report from them, and really have the data that we're going to need to make some good decisions and put forth the best public policy to address your concerns. So that should be coming shortly. But it was the Center for Rural Pennsylvania who provided a $50,000 grant to Penn State University. And then there was also some, well, actually millions of dollars of in-kind donations from Measurement Lab Consortium members and national organizations like the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and the Open Technology Institute. So those organizations have great interest and expertise, and they provided a lot of financial resources and in-kind resources to Penn State University to complete that study. So that's where that came from.
Thank you. It just was kind of ironic, in my opinion, to do the test, you can't get on to do the test.
Exactly.
Or the survey. I guess.
Right. And Betsy can tell you, and Steve will tell you as well, that part of the problem with the maps that we have now that say, the maps that say, well, there's 800,000 Pennsylvanians who don't have access to high-speed internet, is that they're looking at census block data. So when you look at a census block, as long as one person in that census block has high-speed internet, you're viewed as being covered. And we know that nothing could be further from the truth. Right. So, and I will tell you, one of the members of the Intergovernmental Advisory Committee is a representative of one of the Native American nations. And boy, if, I came away from there thinking we're really fortunate here because they really have some challenges. And one of the nations has to contend with 4 different state governments in addition to all of the local governments. And I thought, that just seemed like a monumental challenge. But they really have similar issues and have become great allies in fighting for better data and changing the way we look at the data at the federal level. So as I said earlier, we're predicating big decisions and millions upon millions of dollars of investment, and we want the best data possible. So again, thank you for taking the test.
Can I follow up on that also? I just had a phone call from my local, I believe it was a phone company, saying that they were going to double my service and it would be no extra fee. And I said, well, why do you bother calling me? Just go ahead and do it. It doesn't cost me anything. And but I don't understand how the one gentleman, my neighbor, if you're paying for 12 and you only get one, it seems to me then that's not a good situation for a consumer to be paying for something that you're not getting.
Yeah, let me weigh in just a little bit here on the study. I know Senator Hill mentioned it. The Center for Rural PA is doing the study. I think the final results, at least of the first phase, are due out next month. We've had Sasha Meinrath, who's brilliant at doing this, quite frankly, speak to our group last year and tell us how he was going to do it. I understand the results are still coming in, millions of data points. I'm not a techie to know if you take the test and there's 3 or 4 other people in your house taking the test, what that does to the speed you're getting. I know basically my member companies deliver the speed. They're telling you to your NID, to your house, if there's a lot of people on and they're all watching Netflix, what that does to the speed you get, how that influences the test results you may get. I bristle a little bit about the headlines that are coming out about that study because it says wide swaths of Pennsylvanians don't have broadband. First of all, under Act 183 of 2004, you're statutorily required to have broadband. That definition is 1.544. Don't snicker. I understand that. It's 14, 15 years old now. My member companies have gone well beyond that. But if someone says you don't have broadband, you don't have access to broadband, someone should be calling me about that because we're statutorily required to be there at least at 1.544. As I said, my member companies have gone well beyond that. They continue to invest to get those speeds up. I will tell you, it's interesting you mentioned, sir, that you got a call from your local phone company, presumably, that they're going to double your speed at no cost. What we're seeing from a real-life perspective from my member companies is we are offering tiers of service. A lot of my member companies will offer 1.5, 3, 5, 10, 25 meg. At least one of my member companies offers all those speeds at the same price. And one of my member companies, I will tell you, has, of all the broadband service that's available to their customers, about 50% of their customers are taking 25 meg. So that's the definition that you see in the broadband study, which is a definition we need to get to under certain criteria. The governor's shooting higher. The governor's shooting for 100 meg. The Connect America Fund, which was referenced here earlier, is a definition of 10 meg. The state definition is 1.5 meg. So when you read a headline, read between the lines a little bit. It will behoove you to take a step back and read down through. I guess one of my other problems with some of the things that are coming out is we're advertising speeds we're not delivering. I'm not a big favor of that headline either. Lots of things happen when that speed gets to your residents. We want to be selling the service. It's ideally a money-making proposition for us to sell the service. It's tougher, obviously, in rural areas to do that. But I would encourage anyone who reads a headline that says no one's getting broadband just to take a step back and read the fine print.
Can I follow up with
Absolutely.
the question after that is, how does the consumer know what they're getting? As far as this so-called speed, whether it be 1 or 50 or 100?
Well, I think that test is helpful in that regard, but you can't rely on that solely if there's a bunch of folks in your residence hooked up to the service. I mean, it's not like you get 100 meg to the house and everyone's on the service and everyone's getting 100 meg. That technology just doesn't work that way. It'd be nice if it did, but as always, if you're having a problem with your service, you're not getting the speed you want, lots of things could be impacting that. And yeah, just reach out to your phone company or give me a shout. I mean, this is service that my member companies want to be providing to people, so it's not like they're...
So I found in my personal thing, if I want more speed on the computer, I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to it. 6 o'clock in the evening is out.
It is impacted by all those factors. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, at the risk of being maudlin, I would say that it was nice that they called you on your telephone. They probably tried to email you, but maybe it was undeliverable, but who knows? I'm just saying, that's all. One of the things, though, that does really resonate, though, is that when you have a census block with one having sufficient internet access, and that is translated into the entire census block having access, that underscores the importance of getting the accurate data that you all have mentioned. One of the questions that I would like to ask, though, that deals with the FCC, because when Senator Almond introduced legislation continuing the Universal Service Fund in Pennsylvania, his original sponsorship memo predicated what he felt was a change by the FCC away from the Universal Service Fund preserving landline. So I was hoping that particularly those with the FCC in your portfolio could kind of walk me through the FCC's thinking. Are they thinking of getting rid of the landline use of that fund? Are they planning to supplement? What is the game plan at the federal level?
I know a little bit about that. The National Grange is definitely guarding that landline because, as we know, some areas don't have cell service, so it's so important to maintain the landline at least for a few years yet until we do get universal broadband. So we're kind of afraid that the FCC is going that way because there's such a push for deployment of broadband, which is wonderful, but we're still concerned about those who are not there yet that still need to maintain the landline.
Because the landline is truly the lifeline.
Yes.
And that resonates well with telemedicine. It's great to have all the technological abilities for medicine, but unless you can access it, it becomes less useful. Yes?
I think I have a pretty good handle on what the problem is, but I'm trying to better understand time frames. So a year from now, if you're sitting here at this panel, what concrete steps, what things will actually be done to help someone like him or
The Farm Bill was just passed last month, and that provides $600 million funding that will go out as grants to providers who apply to deploy into the rural areas. So I'm really optimistic that that will help a lot to get unserved areas served. So that's just one thing.
So $600 million, that's nationwide. Right?
Yes.
You're saying
Right. It depends on who applies and who is successful in winning those grants. But that's one pot of money. Then the state has funding available, and if we get an infrastructure bill at the federal level, that was broadband was considered part of the infrastructure that would be included in that also.
I mean, I will say this. The two things that I have always wished that I had as a legislator was a crystal ball and a magic wand, right? So if I had a crystal ball, I could know where we would be in the future. If I have a magic wand, I could fix everything today. And that would be really wonderful. You know, on average, to get a piece of legislation through the legislature, it takes 6 years from conception of idea until signature on governor's desk. And then it may take a few more months to a year after that to get it actually implemented. I mean, I would say that I see the ability to get some legislation done that would identify state-owned assets that we could leverage. I see federal dollars that are going to start flowing into the state. I see the governor prioritizing in his budget additional state dollars to make this happen. And so all of those things are going to come together. And I also think that on the private side, that I do think that there is interest in investing further. And I believe that a lot of that's going to be generated by other businesses. You know, we have a company, York International. They make air conditioners, which everybody loves, especially 6 months from now, right? So, you know, when they put their new headquarters in, they laid tremendous amount of technology resources into that facility. And now those cables are there, and companies that Steve represents can now sort of piggyback off of that and further deploy it into the more rural parts of the county close to that facility, right? So we're seeing those kinds of things happen all the time. And we need to make sure that the regulatory structure doesn't stymie that type of investment. And so those are some of the things that we're going to do. And hopefully a year from now, we're going to come back and we're going to be able to really celebrate some great improvements across the Commonwealth.
If I may, on that question about the $600 million on the Farm Bill, we're going to be experiencing this, as I mentioned earlier, with the Appalachian Regional Commission and the funds available through that program. It is really incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we're aware of those opportunities, but that we work collaboratively as well as we go after those opportunities. And what I mean by that is that from the state's perspective, we work very closely with the local development districts that are situated across the Appalachian Regional Commission. And we work with them to make sure that they're identifying good projects that can be put forward. And then we become champions of those. And so I think we'll see the same thing with the Farm Bill or any other type of funding that might be available, where we need to be aware of it. We need to make sure that we're getting the word out of the opportunities, and then we need to be champions for it, because otherwise it doesn't happen. Probably all of us have gone to DC at some time and lobbied or had discussions rather with legislative members, maybe have testified in front of certain caucuses to really drive home the importance of this. And I think that that's something that we'll continue to do as we move forward, is to make sure that even at the congressional level, that Pennsylvania's delegates, as well as others, are very well aware of the efforts underway in Pennsylvania and what challenges that we continue to have. We need to continue to bring great awareness to this, because it is, in all intents and purposes, it is a crisis in Pennsylvania if we don't have people connected to their doctors and they're not able to take advantage of telehealth, or our students are going to the neighbor's house to do their homework or to the local McDonald's. I had a call with a guy yesterday from Mercer County who happens to work for a school district up there. He drives 15 miles to go to work. That's not the big deal. The big deal is that he doesn't have access at home. And what he can get at home is not affordable for him. So not only is it access, but it has to be affordable access, and it has to be reliable. Because to the point made earlier about just being able to take the test, the reliability is not there in the speeds and the access that we do have. So there are a lot of things that come into play in this. It's just not one size fits all to fix the issue, and it's not one issue. There are multiple issues that we're facing across Pennsylvania.
As far as the recommendations, some of them seem common sense, eliminate the 4 municipality regulations in order to get 20 miles. What is the time frame on that? And, I mean, that doesn't really cost anything. That's just a matter of how the government's going to decide to help businesses. I mean, you want to get deadlines, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Does the FCC have a deadline as far as when they need to act on this?
There are timelines for federal regulation, and of course, right now, nothing's happening. So our BDAC is not even allowed to meet because we're all private citizens, but if we need oversight by an FCC employee, we're not allowed to meet. So nothing's happening in DC.
I mean, did you make the recommendations?
We've been making them from, let's see, probably our first recommendations were July or November in 2017. So some of them are moving through the process already, and some will begin the process this year. I don't know the timelines, but it's probably like 6 months until it's the comment period is over and they can act on it. But things are happening. We're seeing progress in our recommendations and other common sense.
Well, could I ask you to clarify one thing, though? Because you're producing these recommendations to the FCC. If the FCC adopts them and they go through the federal regulatory process, does that become by fiat what the states and locals have to do? Or do they stay on the basis of this is a model that you can pursue if you choose to?
Well, some things that we're recommending are going to be FCC regulation that will be the law of the land. Other things like our model codes are going to be recommended options that they can or don't have to. So it's a mixture of both.
Okay.
Question for Steve. We're hearing a lot about small cell technology and point-to-point distribution of service.
Mhm.
Your member companies are typically smaller folks than the AT&Ts and whatever that are touting these right now, but they are companies that could end up deploying the service. How much do you think your member companies are interested in these type of new platforms to deliver service, and how long do you think it is before one of them potentially, or several of them potentially, adopts?
Well, there's 5G legislation currently pending. Well, in the new session, it will be pending as soon as it's reintroduced. But the legislature's been looking at 5G for at least one session. 5G is a wonderful new technology. It's better in more densely populated areas just because the bandwidth they're using, you need technology every couple hundred yards to make it work, to get to the speeds you want. So we will conquer all these things at one point in time, but I think for the most rural parts of the Commonwealth, from my perspective, and I'm not a technologist, but it has issues because you still need to invest in an infrastructure and a network with repeaters, that's not the proper term, but infrastructure every couple hundred yards to make sure people get that broadband speed. So from my perspective, and I'm obviously a little bit biased, fixed wireline broadband is a better service. I can't tell you it's cheaper to deploy. It's still very expensive. But my member companies look at all of those things to try and get that stuff done. My member companies are not strictly wireless companies. They partner with wireless companies to do certain things to offer that service to their customers. But my member companies are deploying a lot of fiber optic cable, which will do a lot of the great things that people want, the higher speeds in rural areas, the lower maintenance costs as opposed to copper. You don't have squirrels chewing on fiber because it's usually buried, not always, and you don't have the weather conditions that you have with copper. So we're looking at all the type of technologies to get that speed out that people want. And as I mentioned before, we really need to focus in on what people want, because if you're paying the same for 3 meg and 25 meg and you're not taking 25 meg, there's a reason for that. Some of that is on us to make sure people realize the benefits to getting the increased speed. But in a real world example, we're not seeing the type of take rates for the higher speeds that we need to make a business case out of it. So we're very actively monitoring the 5G discussion. I think it's very worthwhile. Some of the things that Betsy mentioned on the BDAC as far as streamlining municipal overview, because if you're downtown somewhere and you need to put something in every other phone pole, you don't want to go pole by pole, and you don't want to wait for permits. You want to get the service out there. So I think from a regulatory perspective, all those discussions are happening, but those are discussions between the industry and the municipalities, the townships, the commissioners, the county commissioners, and those types of folks. So I think it's going to be a great technology. I don't know how useful it is today in areas where there's very, very low population density. But as I said, technology, if history is any example, all those things will be cured. So we're monitoring those things to see if, we're looking at any technology we can to push that higher speed out as far as we can to the end of the line. So.
Well, that kind of brings up something that you said earlier, Steve, about one of the challenges is making the expansion of broadband access, sufficient access, a part of a firm's business plan to make it viable economically to that business. Now, I know Governor Wolf, with that $35 million that they committed, that was meant to kind of leverage some of the private sector broadband development along the US 6 corridor, for example. I suspect that that was in Potter County, where Governor Wolf realized that his cell phone from his car didn't work very well. I'm just saying that's possibly. But in terms of the resource, what will it take to make this a viable business model for private sector companies to make that investment? Because we may have some broadband access that's universal in that because of the state law, but access and affordability remain at odds sometimes. So how do we get there from here? Now, I didn't say I'd be asking easy questions. I just, but how do we get there from here?
I'll take a swing. Ultimately, you need to make this an attractive business model for whoever's providing the service, whether it's one of my member companies or a wireless company or a cable TV company or a startup just trying to get internet service, broadband service out to folks. So one of the things that makes it more attractive is federal funding. What my member companies have done in offering basic voice service is they've relied upon the Pennsylvania Universal Service Fund and the Federal Universal Service Fund to make dial tone affordable. Rural parts of this Commonwealth, even with basic dial tone, you can't necessarily make a business case for it. If we had to charge cost for dial tone in the very rural parts of the state, you may be $50, $75 a month just for your landline phone. So we're trying to make that case in somewhat similar way for broadband as well, because it's very expensive to get out there. And as that case I mentioned, if you're charging the same for 5 meg as you are for 25, and only half the people are taking 25 meg, it's tough to make a business case to provide 100 meg. So you need money to do that. We've looked at a bunch of different ways. Obviously, Sherry and the governor's broadband office are looking at ways to make that attractive. They brought in some PennDOT money to help make that attractive, including some PennDOT projects as well. The Turnpike Commission had, unfortunately, that's kind of been put on the back burner for now, but they looked at using right-of-way in the Pennsylvania Turnpike to get broadband there. But, it all costs money to do that. You could have throwing it out there, a surcharge on your bill for everyone to pay, quarter a month. How do you folks feel about doing that to get broadband everywhere? Is that something you would be interested in doing? I can tell you the fight we're going to have immediately is from the Philadelphia and the Pittsburghs and even the Harrisburgs and the Erie and Scranton folks saying, why am I paying a quarter on my bill to have broadband put in Potter County? Why should I care about that? I mean, that's just a political fight. I've had it with the Pennsylvania Universal Service Fund. But you could solve a lot of these problems, I think, by doing something like that. I'm not advocating for it. I'm not telling you that's where we are necessarily as an association. But you need some funding to help make a business case for these folks who are going out there and doing it, to put it in. If everyone took it, it would be a horse of a different color. But they don't yet. When we reach that point, maybe we have a different discussion. But you need the resources to help make a business case for these folks to do it. Not just my members, but anyone who wants to go in the rural parts of the state to deploy broadband.
Yes.
Can I just follow up on
Oh,
that?
I'm sorry, yes.
We don't have all the answers to that question. We really don't know. And, that's certainly one approach. I think in large part, that's why Pam Snyder and I drafted the resolution to establish that bipartisan, bicameral legislative commission so that they could sit down and methodically work with industry, work with advocacy groups, work with regular citizens and, with the governor's office and say, okay, so really what do we need to do? Because we truly don't have all the answers. And I think that deployment is going to be challenging in different ways in different areas, and we don't really know what it's going to take to fill in Philadelphia versus, deploy into the most remote and regional and rural parts of our Commonwealth. So, I think that it would be a great starting place for all of us. And look, I'm a legislator. I will never tell you that I know everything. I don't know what you don't tell me. So that's why it's important that we have meetings like this so that we can share that information and we can listen to you and we can figure out the best way to forge a path forward.
I just want to take a quick moment to thank Vince and Wayne and the Grange and the panel for advancing broadband for all these many years. A lot of dedication, both for access and affordability. Thanks from all the groups that we represent. This is a big issue. Next week we're hosting an event up in Monroe County. We have more than 100 people signed up from Monroe, Pike, and Wayne counties.
When you say we, who is we?
Accelerate Pennsylvania, we're an advocacy group for broadband in Pennsylvania. So lots of interest around the state. We would lead gigabit projects trying to get the big pipes built so that rural America can get their broadband. At that meeting, we're also talking about the new developments with ATSC technology, with broadcast television towers now getting into the mix. And I want to thank the Senator for her efforts, and we support your bills and your co-sponsorship memo. We hope you join Representative Ferry and lead the effort in the Senate for the PA Partnership for 5G and their legislation. I know he's introducing that bill this week or next week. But our big question is, what can we do to help you? What can we represent in this audience? A lot of groups. What can we be doing to help you advance the ball, maybe in the first quarter here in the year, but over in 2019? This is a big year for broadband.
Thank you. I think that just building momentum and talking to other legislators, because there are still legislators that don't really view this as a problem. So if you live in Montgomery County, you might not really understand why this is a problem. So, reaching out to other legislators, encouraging them to become, part of the broadband caucus, encouraging them to reach out to Pam, to myself, so that we can continue to build a coalition to move forward the legislation that we know is going to be necessary to make this happen. But thank you. Really appreciate it.
Vince, if I could say a couple words. I was in a panel yesterday about fair trade, and I spoke before a couple caucuses on different issues for the Pennsylvania State Grange. And in everything that I talk about, the one thing I emphasize is education. And I think the same thing holds true. The more we can educate each other, because just like Steve said, how am I going to convince the people of Philadelphia to pay a 25-cent surcharge for somebody up in Crawford County convince us to use tax dollars to build a sports complex for you. You know, how does government work? It's give and take. We need to educate each other and not go to the table bullheaded and say, if it doesn't benefit me, I'm not doing it. Because someday you might be driving through Crawford County, have a heart attack, and need emergency services, and guess what? You're not going to get it till another car comes by 15 minutes later and goes to somebody's house and picks up a telephone and calls. We have to be able to look beyond what's the table right in front of me, what's down the road. How can we help each other? So Steve, yes, being a dairy farmer years ago, I'm used to being surcharged for everything that happens and not voluntarily. But it gets to an end point. So I'll stop there, but I think we need to continue to have these open discussions, just like you folks are going to do next week. You know, education. Educate each other, but keep an open mind. Thank you.
And of course, I think it's important for folks to monitor what happens on February 5th. That's when the governor will present his budget address to the General Assembly, and there may be something in that. I don't have any knowledge, so just to let you know. But it may well be that there's something in there showing of some of the broadband efforts that the governor will be undertaking in this budget year as well. Any final thoughts from members of the panel?
Sure, I'll start. Again, I just wanted to thank the Grange for allowing me to be here today. I think that this is really good dialogue, and to your point, Wayne, this is exactly what we need to do. We need to keep the lines of communication open. We need to remember that this isn't about your ability to get Netflix or how fast your speed is, but the fact that we need access regardless. And so we really need to continue to work together. I'll applaud Kelly again and his team and Accelerate PA and the efforts underway there. It's that type of grassroots efforts that is vitally important. There's a role that all of us play in this initiative, and so I think today was a good opportunity to be before you, and I'll look forward to being back next year and being able to demonstrate some of the successes that we will make during 2019. So thank you.
Betsy?
I want to thank the Pennsylvania State Grange for being a leader in this issue. It's nationwide. I hear from our members in Washington State, New England, everywhere that they need broadband access. And I just appreciate all the work that Pennsylvania is doing on this issue and keeping it in the forefront. So thank you.
Thank you.
I will just echo what the prior panelists said, and exceedingly grateful to the Grange to continue to have this conversation and to continue their advocacy. And I appreciate all of your efforts to support all of us in making this happen. So thank you very much.
And since Steve was bludgeoned into being first,
I get half an hour to say whatever I want, right?
we'll all be gone by then, but yes.
Always happens to me. I don't know why. No, thanks, Vince. Thank you and Wayne and Betsy, first of all, for being behind our efforts to help with the Pennsylvania Universal Service Fund for all these years, because, as I said, that's the network that helps get you all the bells and whistles of broadband, and you guys have been, as a Grange, very supportive of what the RLECs have been trying to do here. So thanks again for the invite. Whenever I get invited back to something, that means a couple things. Either you guys have no idea what you're doing, or I said something decent. So I hope it's the latter. You never know. But I appreciate all the questions.
You want me to comment?
Yeah. Appreciate all the questions from the audience and the fact that you folks are here, and always appreciate the opportunity to offer our perspectives, and look forward to hearing from you throughout the year. If there's things that your local phone company can help you out with, feel free to give me a shout. So thanks again.
And with that, we are adjourned.